everyone. Today I have with me author Richie Unterberger. And the last time I talked to Richie, we talked about Fleetwood Mac. But today we're going to be talking about his brand new book out in September 1st. It's called Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh my gosh, I love talking music with you, Richie. And I wish I could describe to everybody because I can't show them, but your books are beautiful. I mean, this is a collector's edition book. This is not something, I've never seen anything like it besides the Fleetwood Mac one that I have. And I'm going to just collect them because they are all your books this way? Because you have a lot of books out.
No, it's just the ones with these publishers, Voyager Press. They have these sort of illustrated books for quite a few artists. For instance, they have one on the doors where I wrote one of the album reviews. And I believe other titles in the series are books on Jimi Hendrix and Bruce Springsteen, maybe U2. I'm not sure of the whole series that they have, but the two that I've done for Voyager Press, like you said, were Fleetwood Mac and Bob Marley. So the format is that it's a fairly large book, a coffee table sized book with a lot of illustrations, a lot of photos, but also like some poster reproductions, some record label reproductions, some ticket reproductions. And I wrote the text, which in both of the cases of Bob Marley and Fleetwood Mac were surveys of their career.
Yeah, I mean, the pictures, it's not just pictures of them, but I love like the tickets. They'll get an original ticket and you have a picture of that and the original albums. I love looking at those pictures because it makes the story come alive. I just love these books. They're amazing.
Yeah, and with Bob Marley, it was more of a challenge than Fleetwood Mac because he and the Wailers, his group, were not internationally famous for the first 10 years or so of their career until 1973 when they had their first album on Island Records. So there aren't nearly as many photos as there are of the Wailers and Bob Marley after that time for the last 8 years of his life. That's why it helps to fill in things like record labels and documents, even some pictures of where he grew up in Jamaica and some other reggae musicians to give the context of his early years.
Right, exactly. And well, first of all, I mean, your writing is amazing. Okay, I love reading your books because okay, when it was when we did Fleetwood Mac, I knew a lot about Fleetwood Mac, but you taught me a lot more than I thought I knew a lot about. I thought I knew almost everything, but I loved your book because I learned so much more about their history. But with Bob Marley, the reason I wanted to do this interview is because for some reason, I'm 52 and I missed it. I was graduating. He died in 81. I graduated in 82. But I don't know, because maybe I grew up in Pennsylvania. I don't know. Somehow I missed the whole Bob Marley thing. Not that I didn't know who he was, but in my music, of what I was listening to on the radio, I just wasn't exposed to it. And I just wanted to talk to you because I'm like, oh my God, I really want to learn about Bob Marley. And I knew reading your book was going to teach me everything I needed to know.
Well, thank you. And
go ahead.
With Bob Marley, he has an unusual career path because I know this sounds a bit morbid, but his music became more famous after he died in 1981 than it was while he was alive, although he was getting a large audience in the last 7 years or so of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I'm not sure exactly where you grew up in Pennsylvania. I did too, although I live in San Francisco now. But
I'm right outside of Philly. I'm Allentown area.
Okay, so you probably were able to receive some of the same radio stations that I was, beaming out of Philadelphia. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. MMR, YSP. Growing up, I'm
trying
to think of the other one.
WDIS for a while, I think, and Bob Marley did get some of his records played on those stations, probably the most on WMMR.
Mm-hmm.
But compared to Fleetwood Mac, I mean, we talked about this a year ago, especially when Rumors came out, it was like almost every song on that record got played constantly, even the songs which weren't hit singles, on 7-inch records. It seems like 7 or 8 of the songs on that record got played all the time, and the album they had before that had 3 or 4 songs like that. So they almost saturated the radio in the late 1970s. I remember Bob Marley songs getting played on the radio. Some of them Get Up, Stand Up,
Right.
and Lively Up Yourself, but not really heavily. And I knew who they were, and they did tour in the United States. I wouldn't say they were exactly underground, but they weren't a huge stadium act yet, although they were kind of getting there near the end of their career. They also had a somewhat bigger audience in England and Europe, but they were more of an album act that had some records that were pretty popular, but not hugely so. Since his death in 1981, the popularity of especially his most famous songs has just built and built. And a big part of that has been a few years after he died, and I cover this in my book, there was kind of a best of Bob Marley compilation called Legend. And for whatever reason, it caught on huge, and it has now sold more than 25 million copies around the world. That has the songs which have become his most famous, and they become kind of anthems, like the ones I mentioned. Also, I Shot the Sheriff, which was a big hit in the 70s, but not for Bob Marley.
Right. Which I did not know, by the way. I did not know that. No.
Yeah, for Eric Clapton.
Right.
Guessing, I'm sure you heard Eric Clapton's version a lot when that came out. Yeah. Yep. So that's one of the biggest selling albums in the world, the Legend album by Bob Marley. But also he's become kind of a symbol for musicians with a social conscience who have, in their work, represented the underprivileged. That's part of the reason he's not just big in the United States. He's pretty big here, but he's really big all over the world. And I can give you an example that's not in the book because it's personal experience that happened after I wrote the book. This summer, I was in Sicily for a few weeks. And you don't think of Sicily, Italy, as a place where reggae is really huge. But when there were people playing, amateur kind of semi-pro musicians playing on the sidewalk or outside of restaurants, it was not uncommon for them to be playing Bob Marley songs. And this is in Sicily, 35 years or so after he's died. So his music, it's kind of internationally accessible to people all over the world who don't have the same kind of background as Bob Marley in countries where English is not the first language spoken. In Italy, in fact, it's not like going to Germany or Sweden where a great many people speak English, especially people who are like under 60. Mm-hmm. Some do in Italy, but it's not really commonly spoken. But his music is internationally understood. I haven't been to Japan, but I hear it's kind of the same thing over there. So it's amazing that a musician from a very small country, I think there are about 3 million people in Jamaica now. When he was growing up and starting his career, it was more like 2 million people. And a country which compared to the United States or Italy or Japan, for that matter, is quite poor in its standard of living, that he and the other Wailers could rise to have such an international impact, not just in terms of selling records, but also in popularizing a form of music that was different from the rock and soul in the United States and Great Britain.
Well, absolutely. I mean, his music was, so much different than what we were listening to, at the end of in the 70s, basically. But when you were talking about like how he's relevant today, my 18-year-old son has a Bob Marley t-shirt. And when he bought it, and this was a couple months ago, I was like, you know who Bob Marley is? He's like, oh my God, yeah, he's awesome. I'm like, okay. Like that, for an 18-year-old, like I didn't even think he knew who Bob Marley was, let alone, has his t-shirt,
And if you travel to different countries and different continents, it's kind of like wearing a Beatles T-shirt. It's a symbol that's internationally understood. Like, you not just you like music, but you like cool music, which has a humanitarian dimension. I've barely traveled in Africa, but I hear that there Bob Marley's status is comparable to the Beatles.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah. And here in San Francisco, like when I was writing the book, it wasn't uncommon, not like every day by any means, but sometimes you would see a Bob Marley T-shirt, or there's a bus stop near my house, which is near the University of San Francisco, and I saw a woman, probably your son's age or a bit older, 18 or a bit older, with a Bob Marley handbag. So just kind of like the Beatles, the Beatles broke up in 1970. We're talking longer than Bob Marley has not been around. Between generations, the music is widely understood, not just by people of our age. I'm just a few years older than you. I'm 55. Mm-hmm. But also people who are our children, or in some cases young enough even to be our grandchildren, know not just his music and the Beatles' music, but kind of what they stood for and the change that they brought to the world.
Yeah, and my 18-year-old is just now dabbling into politics and hearing about it in school, and with everything going on, like when I was talking to him about it last night, knowing I was going to do this interview, and he said, it's interesting how Bob Marley's message is still relevant today. It means so much. Like that's what he loves about him, is that the message of peace in a world of in what he perceives as not very peaceful right now. And, Bob Marley represented, he came out for marijuana, okay, before, of course, everybody in the 70s, but what he attributed to marijuana, and look at what's going, what the states are going through, and specifically my 18-year-old son's generation of, they're trying to get it legalized right now, basically everywhere, and he said that it meant a lot to him about how Bob Marley spoke up for the benefits of marijuana.
Yes, and also I just want to mention, of course, the title of the book is Bob Marley and the Wailers.
Yes.
And
yes,
the two other principal guys in the Wailers, Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston, before the original Wailers broke up in the mid-1970s, they made very important contributions to the development of the Wailers music and reggae music in general. And Peter Tosh, who, like Bunny Wailer, also wrote some songs, he had a song called Legalize It. And he even managed to get that performed on national TV back then, which is amazing.
Wow.
Now, in the book, I should say, I don't make a big deal about his stance on marijuana. It's mentioned because it was, as you say, a part of his public image, his statements. But whatever your feelings about marijuana, there are reasons that many people in this country and in other countries would like to see it decriminalized. In the United States, for one, because it has some medical uses for people who are in a lot of pain. So in that sense, the Wailers and Bob Marley were addressing a controversial issue, and they were taking a stance that for still many people would be considered quite unpopular. But they spoke about it, and in some of their songs, they sang about it because it was important to them, and it was a viewpoint that was not being represented, even in a lot of like alternative or underground rock music of the time.
Right. And back then, we look at the pictures of him now, and he doesn't look that unusual to us. But you stated in the book, you had a little section about it. Back then, his dreadlocks were controversial. It was different, and people didn't know how to take it because they had never seen anything like it before. And the Rastafari image also that he made popular.
Yeah, and even in Jamaica, among people who were black, sometimes it was the not just the dress, but the religion, the Rasta religion, wasn't popular among some classes of black people. The Rastafari faith became a lot more popular starting in the late 60s and then throughout the 1970s. And a lot of the Rastafarian message kind of seeped into Bob Marley and the Wailers songs. But one of the reasons I think that the music is internationally popular is that Marley distilled that so that you didn't need to either be a Rasta or even know much about it to understand and sometimes empathize with the humanitarian messages of the songs.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think that that's why I think his music lives on, because everybody relates to it, as his message is so universal, and you look at him and you're like, how can you not love him? Like, let's put it this way. I don't think I've ever met anybody who was like, I don't like Bob Marley. Like, you may not be a huge reggae fan per se, and that's the music you listen to, but really as a person or as a, celebrity, you didn't hear him making many enemies,
Although, and I've mentioned this in the book, in Jamaica itself, there were, on the more conservative side of the sociopolitics there, people who did not appreciate his rise in popularity, in part because it made underprivileged Jamaicans there feel more empowered. And in a couple instances, this culminated on threats to his very life, especially at the end of 1966 when there was an actual assassination attempt on Bob Marley and some people around him, including his wife. Now, he wasn't really seriously hurt in that instance, fortunately. He died of an illness, which was another kind of tragedy. But one of the really interesting incidents of his life, which is not totally related to his music, although the focus of the book is on his music, is that there are various theories about the assassination attempt, but there is widespread feeling that it was because he was about to take part in a concert that was linked to the more liberal of the two main parties in Jamaica. Mm-hmm. At a time when when an election was approaching, and there was feeling that the conservative factions wanted him kind of out of there because he was helping to educate some of the Jamaican people who might not have voted or were thinking about voting in a different way. And many musicians would have canceled the concert that he was about to give just days after the assassination attempt. And those musicians, if they had decided to cancel, they wouldn't have been criticized because if there's just been an attempt on your life, you might not be in a mood to give a concert anyway, but you also might think, well, maybe something might happen at the concert to me or other people around me. And he went through with the concert. And also, on stage, he asked the leaders of the two opposing political parties who were in attendance to come up and grasp hands. And there's footage of this, and you can see they're not really too happy about it. His message was the most important thing, even with these different political parties battling for power, is to remain peaceful and not be violent. And I'm sure he knew that there wasn't any way that these guys were going to become really friendly and work together, but at least they could take the stage in public and not be at each other's throats, or not have representatives of their parties anyway be at each other's throats. And that still sends a powerful message. As you say today, whatever your political philosophy, there's a lot of turmoil in our country, the United States, and throughout the world. And a message through music and an action like that, which calls for peaceful dialogue and some degree of cooperation rather than, standoffs and threats, is still something that's very valuable.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to look at him, that I think that that's why it's still relevant, unfortunately, I guess, but his message is so, powerful, and lives on for him. And you brought up his death. I think that when I was reading your book, I was, it's just to me, it just seems so tragic, the way that he died, because now back in 1981, I know that, or back, I guess he started to, his toe incident that, was the beginning. That was in 1977. So, but you just think with medicine, I guess he just kind of rejected anything they could have done to help him, right?
Well, not everything that could have been done. It's really hard to say because the illness that he had was very idiosyncratic. As you mentioned, it started because he hurt himself playing soccer. They call it football in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
And it was realized, well, his toe is in really bad shape. And the majority opinion among the medical establishment of that time, I think, would have been we should amputate the toe so that the infection or whatever is going on there doesn't spread and endanger his life. And he rejected the amputation. It was really important to him. I mean, it would be to anybody, but he wanted to be able to dance on stage. If you see the footage, unfortunately, there's a lot of film of him from the mid-'70s onward. You can see he's a very animated performer, whether he's
Right.
playing guitar or not. He's kind of bopping around the stage. He's very involved. He's kind of like almost physically acting out his songs, his lyrics. He didn't want that movement to be curtailed. He was a big soccer enthusiast. He loved playing football almost as much as soccer, as much as he liked playing music. So, as a lot of people would have been, I think he was in denial to some extent. It was like, I can beat this illness. I don't want the toe amputated. Now, looking back, of course, well, it's a lot better to have a toe or two amputated and live a normal lifespan than it is for whatever is going on in that part of your body to spread. But whether it was because the toe wasn't amputated or not, the illness did spread and it became cancer in different parts of his body. And in late 1980, the illness had spread so much that he, collapsed while he was beginning an American tour. And when he finally went to the hospital, it was determined this has spread so far, it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to survive, like even survive more than a few weeks. He ended up surviving about 6 months. But if he had sought more standard treatment for the toe and then later, checkups for the illness, there certainly seems to be a chance that it wouldn't have spread or it could have been caught where it could have been treated. So that's too bad.
Right.
To,
exactly.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, that's an understatement. Of course, he made his mark, so, you can look at it that way, but it's still, especially at our age, we're like, oh, he was so young, he just really was.
36.
Right, he was 36. That's crazy. So when you were doing your research for this book, I don't know how much you knew about him to start off with, but what did you find the most fascinating thing about him?
I knew a lot about him. I mean that's part of the reason I have a deal to do books like this. I bring a lot of knowledge to the project. But something as a writer that interested me the most about doing this book in particular, you've mentioned that you didn't know much about Bob Marley in general, and I hope that for other readers it would serve as a pretty good overview of his life. But even for people who know a fair amount about him, the first 10 years of his career especially are not very well known, or there's not too much known about what he and Peter Tosh and Buddy Livingston, the original Wailers, did before they signed to a very big label, Island Records, and got their records distributed all over the United States and Europe. Before that, they were mostly known just in Jamaica. And it's amazing, for somebody as famous as Bob Marley, there is so much mystery about some basic elements of his life, like before he was in his late 20s. And also the records he did, which were known almost exclusively in Jamaica during that time, they're very good and they're very interesting. He evolves from the popular form of music in Jamaica in the mid-60s, which was ska. It was a little like reggae, but it was much faster. It had a lot of influences from American soul music, to a much more personal style that's a lot more Jamaican, the slower reggae beat with kind of a more tropical feel, and lyrics that are a lot more engaged with social commentary. Those records are available now, fortunately, but they're still not very widely known. The ones he made before 1973, and I Shot the Sheriff, and Stir It Up. Sometimes he did versions with the Wailers of those songs before he re-recorded them for the more popular ones that got played on radio and were on the records for Island. So writing about that was quite interesting for me, but there were still some kind of mysteries that I would have to say, this is what some people think happened, this is what others think happened. It's not known for sure. It probably will never be known for sure. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In 1966, when the Wailers already had these pretty big Jamaican hit records, he moved to Delaware, not very far from where you're living now, Wilmington, in part because he wanted to help his mother, who had emigrated like 3 years earlier, and she married an American guy. But as I mentioned in the book, it indicates how different the Jamaican record industry was. Here was a guy with his group who had a bunch of hit records. He was only 21, and he moves to the United States and takes these really menial jobs, in part because he makes more money doing that than he's making with a hit group in Jamaica. Can you imagine, say, Smokey Robinson, a great soul musician who was having big hits in America at that time, giving up music to work in an auto factory, which is one of Bob Marley's jobs, or to work as a janitor or as a waiter? But that's what Bob Marley did. In part, it was because he wanted to save enough money so he could go back to Jamaica and help start a record label with the other Wailers. But A, the Jamaican audience was really small, like 2 or 3 million people. And B, the musicians, unfortunately, were paid very little. So little, it was like, well, if I can save almost $1,000, that's going to be more money than I can make being a star in Jamaica. There's still uncertainty about the circumstances, about why exactly he moved. He went to Delaware right after he got married and didn't bring his wife along, for instance, a little bit strange. He went back a few times in the late 60s and early 70s, and it's still not clear how often he went back and for how long and why. There's a theory that he was subject to the Selective Service military draft, and that's why he went back. One of the writers who tried to find a record with the Selective Service couldn't find one. So there's all this uncertainty about his career at that time, which is never going to be pinned down. Even when he was alive and gave interviews, sometimes he was pretty vague about what happened. That's just one example. It's also a little mysterious to me. He was managed from the late 60s onward for about 5 years by the same manager of an American soul star named Johnny Nash.
Johnny Nash, yes.
Yeah, who had a big hit with Stir It Up, one of Bob Marley's songs. But it seems like the management wasn't very efficient. They signed him and the other Wailers to a songwriting contract, but they didn't get his songs done by Johnny Nash for about 5 years. And even though they paid him $100 a week, which was actually a decent wage in Jamaica at the time, he felt like he still had to go to Jamaica and went to Sweden to make more money. It doesn't all add up to me. On my blog, I've done like a little series of here's some stuff which is kind of peculiar about his early career. So I wouldn't say I learned a whole lot more than I didn't know. That wasn't surprising. But even trying to consolidate this for a book to make it readily understandable to someone who might be reading about Marley in depth for the first time, I couldn't resolve all these contradictions in his early career, why he didn't become famous, more famous earlier, why he kept going back to the United States, why sometimes he was working with the Wailers and not. As opposed to someone like Smokey Robinson, say, you can't find out these details. Smokey Robinson is pretty straightforward. He met Berry Gordy, who ran Motown Records. They started kind of collaborating together. He had a big hit in 1961, and more hits followed. But the documentation for the Jamaican record industry is a lot sketchier. Some of the records, it's like not even certain whether they came out or not. I mean, it's that strange. So that aspect was interesting to me. But of course, that's only 1/3 of the book or so. And the remaining 2/3 covers when he starts to rise to international acclaim in the 1970s and early 80s.
Yeah, and what I found interesting is that I feel like we always look at people as a, they come out with a record and boom, they're an international success. Like, and when you dive deeper into what they had to do, I mean, I thought it was awesome the way you laid out what was happening with him during that time, because he wasn't an overnight success. They worked very hard and, for nothing, basically, for a lot of their career, they were working for nothing. And I don't know, it gives you a show of their character and why, music was just very important to him. And the money wasn't so much as important. And I think that you also showed that even later in his life, money wasn't a driving force for him.
Well, he did enjoy the rewards of stardom. I don't want to mislead any prospective readers. But as one example, near the end of his life, he visited Africa and gave a few concerts there, not too many. And it was so important to him to bring his music to an African audience because that's a region where the standard of living is even, and was and is, quite a bit lower than it was in Jamaica for all the poverty there, that he wanted to play live in front of people. And at great expense, he brought over, his standard concert rig, which by the late 70s was pretty complicated with all the people, all the musicians in his band, the backup singers, and the equipment. And he knew, I'm pretty sure, that he was going to lose a fair amount of money. Like, it might not sound like a lot today, but it was more back then. Maybe, I think he spent about $250,000 to bring everything over. I don't think he got paid nearly that much as far as concert fees. But the satisfaction that he got from making a statement, bringing the music over, meant more to him, as you say. One of the concerts that he played, or a couple, were when the nation of Zimbabwe declared independence, the former Rhodesia. That was a big statement for people of color around the world and in Africa, because that country, like a lot of parts of Africa, had been ruled by colonies, by overseas powers for a long time. They were declaring independence and also even taking a new name from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. And he was able to play there as part of the independence celebrations. So, I mean, he didn't live that much longer after that, so there aren't many interviews where he's talking about that. But I think if he had lived longer, he would look back on that and say, I'm so proud that I got to be in that country performing and giving my message to people at a time when they were making that break into independence. And probably, I mean, you can't project onto this. My guess would be he would have loved to have, say, participated in ceremonies when the nation of South Africa was ending apartheid and Nelson Mandela was assuming the presidency there, because the message of his music was very popular there too. And he would have loved to have seen South Africa make that progress and be a part of that in some way in the 1990s.
Yeah. I can't even explain to everybody. Like, you just need to get this book. Okay. It is, not only is it beautiful, but your story of him is so amazing. I love the story of Bob Marley and what he brings to even now. But I thought that, you're one of my favorite writers. Okay. I love talking music with you. It's one of my favorite things. I was looking forward to this so much. And So I have to ask a question. What is next? Like, you've stuck so much into this. This just came out. Are you working on anything else?
No, unfortunately, I don't have a publishing deal. And part of this is in the publishing industry. I don't want to harp on it too much because I've gotten to publish about a dozen books, and that's about a dozen more than many writers are able to do. There's uncertainty about what people want to read and what people want to buy. And that means that not just this publisher, but any publisher, the criteria of whether they want to do a book isn't always only, is this going to be really interesting or are people going to like it? It's also going to be, what are people going to buy? Because so we don't lose money on this. Hopefully that we make some money. And there's uncertainty about what to do. Some people feel there should be books about huge stars because people only want to learn about music that they are really familiar with. Now, you've already said this is kind of a contradiction to this. You didn't know much about Bob Marley. You knew something about him, but you didn't know a whole lot, and you enjoyed this book. Hopefully, it's also made you curious about, oh, there are some records of his I'm not too familiar with. These days, it's very easy to hear them online or elsewhere. I can check them out. Or, in your situation, this is even better. You have a son who's pretty interested in this stuff. You can kind of check it out together and use this book or a book similar to it as kind of a guide to giving you an idea of what you'd be most interested in. One thing about the format of these books that this publisher does, there are reviews of every one of Bob Marley's records, not just within the main text, but there's like separate sidebars where there's a page or two talking about albums of his like Catch a Fire and Exodus, but also some pretty unknown ones like the two that he did before he became famous, or two of the ones that he did. I wrote the reviews of those. But to get back to your question, so there are some books about stars I'd like to do, but I don't want to take the standard angle all of the time. There are some books about lesser known people than Bob Marley, where I've gotten some feedback where we like your proposal, but we don't want to do this book because we don't want to sell. We don't think it's going to sell enough copies to justify giving you a contract and going to the expense of publishing it. I know I'm being pretty vague here. I'm not trying to be evasive, but I don't have a book deal in part because some of my proposals have been rejected for those reasons. Now, whether it's honest or not, the publishers haven't said, we don't like your idea or the way you write. They said, we don't know what people want to buy. There's also some uncertainty about historical figures. If someone is not putting out albums right now, which are selling a whole lot, even though they have sold a lot in the past, the feeling might be, well, maybe some young people don't know them or don't care about them. So it's a frustration, but I do want to do more books. Don't know what they'll be yet. When the books come out, I'll be sure to let you know in case you're interested in speaking with me about those.
Well, you know what, Richie, you and I can go. I don't even care about going forward. I'd love to go back. You've written some books. You know, when I go through your Amazon page, I mean, you know, we're from the same generation. I'm like, I don't even know a lot about The Who. I think, here's the thing, I think I know a lot about the Beatles, but when I was looking at some of the titles, I was like, wow, there's probably a lot I don't know about the Beatles. And, you know, we can always go back and chat because I love talking music with you. But, you know, when I look at this book and I think, in my brain, I'm like, oh my God, you could, you know, this kind of book is such a collector's item. You could do so much. I mean, there's so much music, and people from our generation that want to buy a book like this and want to read it, you know, I think it's like limitless. So you know, that's my opinion, you know?
Yeah. And just one general observation, not particular to whether or what other books that I'm going to be doing.
Yes.
I think that rock and soul music, you know, the popular music of the 20th century, has proven to have a lot more durability and a much more of a multi-generational audience than people have predicted. I'll just give you one example. I saw The Who wait, it is last month. It's about 6 weeks ago now. They played in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco
Wow.
as part of a festival. Unfortunately, it's kind of like the Half Who because it's just two of the four original guys. But it's the main songwriter Pete Townsend, the lead guitarist, and the main singer Roger
Daughtry.
Daltrey.
Right.
And at this festival was really geared mostly towards young people. When you walk around this 3-day festival, you're of a similar age to my age. There are a lot more people of your son's age than our age, than our peers. There are a lot of people between, say, 17 and 30. That is like at least 80% of the audience, and most of the acts are artists who have emerged in the last 10 years. That's fine. When there were rock festivals in the 60s and 70s, they didn't invite usually Benny Goodman and people like that. It was people who were pretty young, in their 20s and 30s, the performers. The audience was usually in their 20s and 30s. This is a festival that's kind of like that. But when the Who went on, because they have like 3 or 4 what you might call legacy acts in this festival as well,
Mm-hmm.
there were people our age, but there were a lot of people young, between 15 and 35, who were at the Who's show. There were probably like 30,000 people. It was at a very big field in Golden Gate Park. But also, I could tell that a lot of the people who were young were really familiar with the Who's music. It wasn't like, well, my dad said you should check this group out. Or like,
Right.
I'm at this festival anyway. I've already paid for the day's admission. I don't know anything about these guys, but I'll see what this is about. They knew songs like whatever, Won't Get Fooled Again, My Generation, I Can See for Miles, songs from the rock opera Quadrophenia. That isn't the case with everybody. I'm not sure how many really young people know Simon and Garfunkel's music or Joni Mitchell's music. But I think that the appeal of historical music is really underestimated. It was underestimated when I was a teenager in the late 70s.
Yes.
And you might remember the Doors made a big comeback, even though Jim Morrison had been dead for a while, because they had not been played on the radio very much for almost 10 years. And there was a biography and there was a resurgence of interest in them. When I was in high school in the late 70s, there was only one other guy in this school, a public school, which there were 400 odd people in each class, so maybe like about 1,500 people in the whole school. Only one other guy was heavily into the Doors, just because their music wasn't absolutely current. But the Doors, like Bob Marley, that might be more popular now than they were when they were at their peak, when their lead singer, Jim Morrison, was alive. If music's really good and there's a really good story behind it, that's also the case with the Doors, like it is with Bob Marley and the Wailers. I think listeners are always going to be interested in it, whether they have a nostalgic connection to it from their youth or not.
Absolutely. And I know that my son gets exposed because Pandora has like a classic rock. He'll get into his car and, not that he doesn't listen to current music, but he'll go on the classic rock and, he'll say to me, did you know Tom Petty? I'm like, yes. Yes. Like, they get exposed to, did you ever hear Boston? Did you ever hear, he's always asking, I'm like, yes, I've heard of all those people. I know who they are. Like, I don't know. But I do remember, when I was late 70s, early 80s, it wasn't just the Doors, like the Kinks came back. Of course we were all listening to Led Zeppelin already, but, I look at a lot of Creedence started to come, people were listening to that. A lot of that 60s music came back again and started to become popular. So I guess there's a reason they call it classic rock, is because it just doesn't go away,
Yeah, and it's funny when you look at reports at the time, not for the Wailers, but more like the 60s with the Beatles and the Who, not in the music press, but in the mainstream press, early on in those bands' careers, they were treated almost like novelties, like this is something that kids are into for a few months, it's a fad, it's going to be totally forgotten. And it's actually among the most long-lasting parts of culture from that time. Now, I know you might not use this for the Bob Marley interview, but just as one example, as long as we're on that tangent,
Mm-hmm.
there's a series on public television now that's getting very wide viewership because it's a very important topic, the Vietnam War, Ken Burns.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and in that series, I don't know if you've seen episodes yet or not. Because I have to be out some nights, I haven't seen more than a couple. But they're using music from that time, not just music about protesting the war by any means, just music to set the context of that time from all over the place. Jimi Hendrix, Procol Harum, Whiter Shade of Pale. There was a minute of the Beatles, soul music by Sam Cooke. So it's realized by major media now that this music, it's not just entertainment of that time that was a fad. It's as much a part of history as the current events and the politics of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's going to keep happening with music, but it certainly applies to music from the time rock music and soul music started, I believe.
Right. Well, like I said, Richie, you and I can talk about any one of your books. I have no problem with that. I love reading your stuff. It's amazing. And I learned so much, and I love reading about music and the history of music. And, so whenever you want to come on, you just tell me and we'll do it. Okay?
Okay. And as I said, I know you might not use this in what you upload.
If everybody's still listening, they can listen to us talk about rock. So
yeah. But I was just going to say, whatever my next music book is, I'll let you know. So if you're still taping, can we leave this next part off the record?
Yeah, well, we'll just end this now, and then I'll stay on. Okay, I'll just end the recorder. But everybody, go get the Bob Marley. I'm going to give these away as presents. Okay, that's how amazingly beautiful they are. Okay, it's not. I mean, this is a book to be given as a gift, and you will not be disappointed. So, thank you, Richie.